My husband served divorce papers over 4 daughters. He had no idea who I really was. I remember the exact sound the pen made when he set it down on the hospital tray, right next to the plastic jug of water and the paper cup nobody had touched. It was such a small, ordinary sound, and yet it split my whole life into a before and an after. I was still holding our 4th daughter. She was 11 minutes old. Her fingers were curled around my thumb the way all of theirs had been, the way her 3 sisters' fingers had curled around mine years before her, and I remember thinking, in that strange fog after childbirth, that this was supposed to be the happiest moment a person could have. And then Richard cleared his throat and told me he wanted a divorce. He didn't shout. He didn't even look particularly angry. That was the worst part, if I'm honest. He looked like a man closing out a business deal that hadn't gone the way he'd hoped. He stood at the foot of the hospital bed in his good coat, the navy one I'd bought him for our anniversary 2 years earlier, and he told me that he'd given this marriage everything he had, and that he deserved a son, an heir, someone to carry his name forward properly, and that 4 girls was, in his words, not what I signed up for. I remember, in that moment, the strange betrayal of my own body. My arms were still trembling from labor, my chest still tight with the particular exhaustion that comes after bringing a person into the world, and somewhere underneath all of it, my heart was doing something I didn't have a name for yet, a kind of folding in on itself, quiet and total, like a house settling after an earthquake nobody else had felt. I looked down at Rose, at her small furious face, still faintly pink, still faintly cross at having been born into a cold room, and I thought, with a clarity that frightened me, that she would never know how close she had come, in her very first hour of life, to being called a disappointment by the man who was supposed to protect her most. I did not cry in front of him. I want you to know that, because it mattered to me even then, in the wreckage of it, that he would not get to see it. I kept my face as still as I could manage, and I nodded, once, as though he had told me something as ordinary as the weather, and I watched him wait, just for a second, for some kind of scene. Some kind of pleading. I think some small, vain part of him wanted me to beg. When I didn't, when I simply held our daughter tighter and said nothing at all, I saw something flicker across his face, not guilt exactly, but a kind of disappointment that I hadn't given him the ending he'd rehearsed on the drive over. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment. Not what I signed up for. As though I was a defective investment. As though our daughters, Amelia, Charlotte, Grace, and now baby Rose, were disappointing quarterly results rather than 4 living, breathing human beings who loved him before they even knew what love was. He told me he'd already spoken to a solicitor. He told me the papers were drawn up and all I needed to do was sign, and that he'd be reasonable about it, generous even, because he wasn't a monster, he said, he just needed a life that matched the man he was becoming. He had a new position waiting for him, he said, an executive role at Halstead Pierce Group, one of the largest holding companies in the country, and there was a woman too, though he didn't say her name that day, not yet. He said it all so calmly. So sure of himself. So sure that I was the small one in this story and he was the one about to become big. I signed nothing that day. I asked the nurse to take the papers and put them somewhere so I didn't have to look at them, and I held my daughter, and I cried the kind of tears that don't make a sound, and somewhere underneath the grief, so far underneath that I almost couldn't feel it yet, something else was starting. Something that felt almost like relief. Almost like the lifting of a mask I had been wearing for 11 years. Because here is the thing Richard never knew. Here is the thing I had never told him, not once, not in 11 years of marriage, not through 4 pregnancies, not through the mortgage payments he complained about or the school fees he grumbled over or the modest little house in Surrey he thought was the best I could ever hope to provide alongside his salary. Richard did not marry a struggling assistant from the marketing department, which is what he believed. Richard married Eleanor Whitmore Ashcombe, the only granddaughter of Edmund Ashcombe, founder of the Ashcombe Estate Trust, the family that quietly owned, among a great many other things, 94% of a company called Halstead Pierce Group. I had never told him. Not out of some scheme, not at first. In the beginning I hadn't told him because I liked, for once in my life, being loved for nothing but myself. My grandfather had died when I was 22, and left me an inheritance so large it had frightened me, so I'd done what frightened young women with too much money sometimes do. I disappeared into an ordinary life. I changed how I dressed. I took a modest flat. I used my mother's maiden name at work and let people believe I was simply Eleanor Ashcombe from Guildford, a marketing coordinator with a nice smile and a tidy little car. I met Richard at a work conference. He was ambitious and charming and terribly funny in those days, and he had no idea, none at all, that the woman he was chatting up over stale coffee held, quietly, through a network of trusts and holding companies even my own accountants sometimes struggled to fully map, the controlling interest in the very industry he was so desperate to conquer. I kept the secret because I wanted, just once, to know if a man could love me without knowing what I was worth on paper. And for a while, I believed he did. We married in a small ceremony. We bought our modest house together. I let him believe my family money, the money that quietly paid off the mortgage in year 3, the money that covered Charlotte's medical bills when she was born early, the money that somehow always appeared exactly when we needed it, came from a small trust my late grandfather had left me, nothing more. He never asked too many questions. Men who believe they are the architects of their own success rarely do. And then Amelia was born. Then Charlotte. Then Grace. And with each daughter I watched something in Richard curdle a little further. He loved them, in his way, in the way a man loves a photograph of a life he thought he was going to have. But every christening, every birthday, every school play, there was a tightness around his eyes, a question he never quite asked out loud. Where is my son? Where is the boy who will carry my name? As if a name were a thing that could only travel forward through sons, as if my daughters weren't already, each of them, sharper and braver and more extraordinary than he had ever managed to be. By the time I was pregnant with Rose, our fourth, Richard had already begun his affair. I knew. I had known for months. I am not a foolish woman and I have never been a foolish woman, whatever Richard believed. I knew about Portia, 29 years old, the daughter of a minor property developer, all competence and expensive highlights, who worked in the same building as Richard and had made it very clear, through the kind of comments women like that make when they think no one else is truly listening, that she thought Richard was destined for far greater things than a wife who'd let herself go after 3 children and a modest home in Surrey. I let it happen. I let him believe he was getting away with something, because I was watching something else unfold entirely. Because roughly 14 months before that hospital room, my grandfather's old friend and the current chairman of Halstead Pierce Group, a shrewd and quietly devoted man named Julian Vance, had come to me with a proposal. Halstead Pierce needed restructuring. It needed new blood in its executive ranks, ambitious men willing to prove themselves under intense scrutiny, and Julian, who had known me since I was a child sitting on my grandfather's knee learning what a balance sheet was, had a rather particular idea. He had noticed, in the ordinary business of running one of our family's companies, a mid-level manager named Richard Alcott, my own husband, climbing the internal ladder in the finance division with unusual speed. Too much speed for his level of talent, if I'm honest, though Richard never once questioned why the promotions kept coming, why his projects kept landing on the right desks, why doors that should have taken him a decade to open seemed to swing open in 18 months instead. Julian asked me, quite plainly, whether I wanted to know what kind of man my husband really was when he thought no one who mattered was watching. I said yes. So for over a year, without Richard's knowledge, I had been quietly, deliberately, engineering the exact scenario he was walking so confidently into. Every fast-tracked project. Every glowing performance review that landed on Julian's desk. Every whisper that Richard Alcott was a name to watch at Halstead Pierce. All of it moved him steadily, rung by rung, toward an executive vice presidency that came with one final requirement before ratification by the board. A contract. A very particular, very binding contract, drafted by our family's own legal team, full of clauses about loyalty, about conduct, about the kind of ironclad non-compete and reputational protections that ambitious men in a hurry rarely read closely enough. Richard signed that contract 3 days before he served me the divorce papers in that hospital room. He signed it in a state of pure euphoria, certain he'd finally outmaneuvered a world that had never given him enough credit, certain that the woman waiting for him at the top, the one who'd apparently taken a personal interest in his career, was some faceless, powerful benefactor he'd simply been lucky enough to impress. He had no idea it was me. He left the hospital that day with his coat buttoned and his shoulders back, practically glowing, off to celebrate his promotion with Portia at some overpriced restaurant in the city, while I lay in a hospital bed with a newborn daughter and 3 others waiting at home with my sister, utterly unaware that within 6 weeks, he would be sitting across a boardroom table from the woman he'd just abandoned in a delivery room, and that she would be the one holding his entire future in her hands. The weeks after he left were, if I am honest with you, some of the hardest of my life, and I don't want to pretend otherwise, because I think stories like this one do a disservice to women when they skip over the pain and rush straight to the revenge. There is no triumph in this story that erases the nights I sat up with Rose, feeding her at 3 in the morning while Grace cried in the next room because she missed her father, while Charlotte, only 7, asked me very seriously whether she had done something wrong. There is no triumph that erases having to explain to a 7-year-old that no, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong. Some fathers simply aren't big enough on the inside for the family they were given. I let myself grieve. I let myself be furious. I let myself, some nights, simply sit on the kitchen floor with my back against the cupboards because I couldn't hold myself upright any longer. There was one night, about 3 weeks after he left, when Rose wouldn't settle no matter what I did, and Grace had a fever, and Charlotte had woken from a nightmare crying for a father who wasn't coming, and I remember standing in the hallway at 2 in the morning with a screaming baby on my shoulder, feeling something inside my chest crack clean down the middle. Not because I missed him. I want to be honest with you, because by then I don't think I missed him at all. It was something lonelier than that. It was the particular grief of realizing that I was now the only wall standing between my children and every hard thing the world might ever try to do to them, and that if I broke, even for a moment, there was no one behind me to catch what fell. I let myself feel that too. I didn't rush past it the way people sometimes tell you to, chin up, stiff upper lip, all of that. I sat with it. I let it teach me something about exactly how much I was capable of carrying. Because I think you cannot know your own strength until it has been tested somewhere quiet, somewhere no one is watching and applauding you for it. Amelia found me on the kitchen floor once, that same difficult month, and instead of being frightened, she simply sat down beside me in her little pajamas and put her head on my shoulder, and said, very seriously, for a 9-year-old, we're still 4, Mummy. Just us 4. That's still a whole family. I have never forgotten that sentence. I don't think I ever will. And then, every morning, I got up, and I fed 4 daughters, and I went to work in the quiet, unglamorous way I had for years, the way that let me watch everything, learn everything, and prepare for the moment I knew was coming. Because I had already decided, long before Richard ever handed me those papers, that if he chose to leave, he would leave in the way he was choosing. Coldly. Selfishly. Over daughters he should have been proud of. And if that was the man he truly was underneath the charm, then I owed it to my girls, and frankly to myself, to make absolutely certain the world saw exactly who he was too. 6 weeks after Rose was born, the board of Halstead Pierce Group convened for what Richard believed was his formal ratification meeting, the final rubber stamp on the executive vice presidency he'd worked so hard, or so he thought, to earn. I know exactly how that morning went for him because Julian described it to me afterward in careful, almost gentle detail, the way a friend describes a car crash to someone who wasn't there but deserves to know. Richard arrived early. He wore a new suit, tailored, expensive, paid for partly with the salary increase he'd already begun spending in his head. He shook hands in the lobby with a confidence that people who knew him well would have recognized as the particular swagger he got whenever he believed he'd finally proven everyone wrong about him. Portia had wanted to come with him, apparently, wanted to see him take his throne, in her words, but the invitation had been strictly for him alone. A final, private audience with the family behind the company. He was led up to the 40th floor, into a boardroom with glass walls overlooking the whole gray sprawl of the city, a room he had walked past 100 times but never once been inside. And there, at the head of that table, not in a power suit, not with some dramatic entrance, just sitting quietly with a folder in front of her the way she had 1,000 times before in 1,000 less glamorous meetings, was me. I want you to understand what that moment was, because I have thought about it many times since. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't a scene from a film where the villain gets his comeuppance to a swelling orchestral score. It was, above everything else, silence. Richard stood in that doorway for what Julian later told me felt like a full minute, though it was probably only 5 or 6 seconds, simply staring, his mouth slightly open, his new leather folder held loosely in one hand as though he might drop it. "Eleanor," he said. "Just my name. Nothing else." As though saying it might make the situation resolve itself into something he could understand. I asked him to sit down. I was quite calm, because I had promised myself I would be. I told him that I was Eleanor Whitmore Ashcombe, granddaughter of Edmund Ashcombe, and that the Ashcombe Estate Trust held controlling interest in Halstead Pierce Group, along with several other companies he would recognize, and that I had chaired this particular board for the last 3 years under my mother's maiden name, quietly, the way my family had always preferred to operate. I watched every certainty drain out of his face in real time. I watched him try, and fail, to reconcile the woman he'd left in a hospital bed 6 weeks earlier, the woman he'd called a burden, unambitious, not enough, with the woman now sitting at the head of the boardroom that controlled his entire professional future. I did not raise my voice once. I simply explained, in the same tone I might use to explain a quarterly report, that the accelerated promotions he'd received over the past 14 months had not, in fact, been earned through his talents alone, however much he might have wanted to believe that, but had been part of an internal evaluation process I had personally overseen, designed to determine, once and for all, what kind of man Richard Alcott truly was underneath the ambition. And that the results, I told him, had been extremely clear. Then I asked Julian to bring out the contract. Richard's contract. The one he'd signed 3 days before serving me divorce papers, full of clauses he had clearly never read closely, clauses regarding conduct unbecoming of an executive of the company, regarding conflicts of interest, regarding, quite specifically, the termination of any executive found to have engaged in conduct that brought reputational harm to the family behind the trust that owned the company, whether or not that executive was aware of the family's identity at the time. Richard had, without knowing it, signed away his own protection the moment he decided to discard his wife and newborn daughter for a promotion and a younger woman. He had built his entire triumphant new chapter on a foundation I had poured myself, and every single beam in it belonged to me. I terminated his employment that morning. Not out of cruelty, though I understand if it looked that way to him in the moment, but because a man who treats his family the way Richard had treated his had already, in every way that mattered, disqualified himself from representing mine. His assets connected to the company were frozen pending an internal review that, unsurprisingly, turned up several instances of expense misuse he'd assumed no one would ever scrutinize closely. His new title evaporated before it had even been formally announced. And the tenancy on the flashy new flat he'd already put a deposit on, the one meant for his fresh start with Portia, well, it turned out that flat belonged to a property portfolio also connected, several layers removed, to my family's holdings. His reputation across the industry, built so carefully over 18 months of manufactured success, unraveled within a matter of weeks, because word travels fast among people who suddenly realize they've been quietly watching the wrong person the whole time. Portia, for her part, did not stay. I understand she left rather abruptly once it became clear that the executive future she'd hitched herself to had disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. I take no particular pleasure in that, though I won't pretend it didn't feel, in some small human way, like justice settling gently into place. I want to be honest about something else too. I did not do any of this to punish Richard for the sake of punishment. I did it because I needed him to understand, clearly and completely, the cost of what he'd chosen. I needed him to know, in the same boardroom where he thought he was finally becoming somebody, that the woman he'd dismissed as not enough had, quite literally, built the empire beneath his feet. But this story was never really about Richard. It was never about winning against him, or humiliating him, satisfying as some part of me will admit that was. It was about my daughters. It was about Amelia, Charlotte, Grace, and Rose, and what kind of mother I wanted to be for them, and what kind of world I wanted them to inherit. In the months that followed, I began doing something I had put off for years out of a strange, misplaced instinct to stay small. I began bringing my daughters, even Rose and her little carrier, into the world I had spent my whole adult life quietly hiding from them. I brought Amelia, the eldest, to her first board meeting when she was 10, and let her sit beside me and ask whatever questions she wanted, no matter how simple. I told Charlotte, when she was old enough to understand it, the whole story, not to make her hate her father, but so she would understand that her worth was never, not for one single moment, determined by whether she was born a boy. I stopped hiding the Ashcombe name. I stopped pretending to be smaller than I was. I began, slowly, teaching my daughters not just about the company, but about what it means to hold power quietly, to use it carefully, and to never, ever let anyone convince you that your value depends on meeting someone else's narrow idea of what you should have been. Richard sees the girls now, occasionally, under carefully structured arrangements our solicitors put in place. He has, from what I understand, taken a much smaller position at a much smaller company, one with no connection to my family at all, and he has, I am told, grown quieter, humbler, more aware than he ever was during our marriage of exactly how far a person can fall when they build their pride on something they never actually earned. I don't know if he has learned the lesson he needed to learn. Some men never do. But I know my daughters have learned theirs. I sat all 4 of them down not long ago, in the same house Richard once complained was too modest for a man of his supposed ambitions, and I told them, plainly, that one day, when they are ready, the Ashcombe Estate Trust and everything connected to it will belong to them. Not to a son that was never born, because there was never anything missing to begin with. To them. Because true legacy was never about a name passed down through sons. It was never about heirs in the way Richard understood the word. It is about character. It is about resilience. It is about 4 girls who watched their mother get discarded in a hospital room and grow, instead of smaller, into someone who could not be discarded at all. I remember, after I told them, how quiet the room went. Rose, who is old enough now to understand far more than people expect, climbed into my lap the way she used to when she was small, and asked me if I was ever scared, back then, in the beginning, when it was just the 2 of us and her sisters and an empty side of the bed. I told her the truth, because I promised myself long ago that I would never raise my daughters on the same kind of comfortable performance her father built his whole life around. I told her yes. I was terrified. I told her that some nights I didn't know if I was doing any of it right, that I cried more than she probably ever saw, that there were mornings I had to sit in the car in the driveway for a full minute before I could make myself walk into the house and be strong again. And I told her that being frightened and doing it anyway was the only kind of courage that had ever actually meant anything to me. Charlotte asked me, quietly, if I ever wished things had gone differently. If some part of me wished he had stayed. I thought about that question for a long time before I answered, because I owed her an honest answer and not a tidy one. I told her that for a long while, yes, some small wounded part of me wished he had chosen differently, had looked at his 4 daughters and seen a family instead of a failure. But I told her that I have stopped wishing for that now, because a man who needed a son to feel proud of his own children was never going to be the father any of them deserved, whether he'd gotten his heir or not. I told her that his leaving didn't break us. It revealed us. It showed me exactly what my daughters were made of, and it showed them exactly what their mother was capable of when there was no one left to lean on but herself. Amelia, the eldest, didn't ask a question at all. She simply reached across the table and took my hand, the same steady, quiet way she'd sat beside me on the kitchen floor all those years ago, and said, "I'm glad it was us 4, Mum. I wouldn't trade any of it." And I understood then, more than in any boardroom, more than in any moment of triumph over Richard, that this exact feeling, for daughters who had turned pain into closeness instead of scar tissue, was the only inheritance that had ever truly mattered. He thought he was leaving a burden behind to chase something bigger. What he never understood, what men like him rarely understand until it is far too late, is that he was never chasing anything at all. He was simply walking, step by careful step, straight into the one room in the entire world where the woman he'd underestimated was always going to be waiting. If this story moved you, if you found yourself hoping, somewhere around that boardroom door, that Richard would finally understand exactly who he'd thrown away, then I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me what part hit you hardest. And if you enjoyed this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more, because there are many more stories like Eleanor's still to come, and you won't want to miss the next one.